As someone who has made hundreds of builds in Elden Ring, I thought it'd be a good idea to start this little mini-series where we go through the top 10 weapons for each attribute scaling stat in the game, so going from strength all the way down to arcane. I even asked you guys in the community tab to see what weapon type you would like to see first, and the majority of you voted on Faith. So today I'm going to be showing you my top 10 Faith weapons that you can use in Elden Ring right now. And just quickly before we jump into the list, I do just want to give a little caveat. All of the footage that you're going to be seeing in this video is from New Game Plus 7, so just bear that in mind when you're seeing the damage output, because of course if you're in your base New Game or an early New Game Plus, you're going to be doing a lot more damage than what I was doing in the footage. And I am purely talking about PvE. I am not a PvP player, mainly because I can't be bothered to wait 30 minutes to get into a game or invade someone else's world, so I am mainly going to be talking about the PvE aspects of these weapons. So I do apologize in advance if there isn't a weapon here that is a absolute god in the PvP scene. I just wouldn't know because, like I say, I don't play it. But now that you've slewed me in the comments for not being a PvP player, we can now crack on with this top 10 list. And in the number 10 spot, we have got ourselves the Halo Scythe, a very strong weapon that has a lot of versatility, because not only is it a Scythe or Reaper class and therefore is a very long weapon, but it also has a very useful Ash of War, being Miquella's Ring of Light, that sends out basically a ring of light, as the name of the attack suggests, but is actually brilliant for NPC fights, because basically this animation will roll catch NPCs as they go to dodge the initial slash when you're casting this particular spell, and then typically after they've rolled, the light is heading towards them and they don't have time to dodge it, therefore obviously catching them after their roll. But not only this, they also deal a nice amount of damage, and it's going to be pure holy damage too, so as long as your enemy isn't heavily resistant to holy damage, you can easily do thousands of damage just simply with this Ash of War, and you can do it at a very comfortable range too. But the other benefit is if your enemies are up close and personal, or you do just want to use the Scythe in general with its base moveset, you also have an innate bleed build-up, which is of course perfect, especially if you're in the later new games like I am in the footage. So basically you've got brilliant range, a nice moveset, and innate bleed build-up to go along with it, which makes this a very fun and cool weapon to be using, which is of course why it had to feature in this list. And putting it at the number 10 spot is a good benchmark for obviously the rest of the weapons that we're going to talk about. And in fact, the next weapon we're going to be talking about is the one in the number 9 spot, which is going to be the Black Knife. Now, although this is a dagger, so it isn't really ever going to put up the same damage numbers as the Halo Scythe that we just talked about, especially with just the base moveset. The reason why this is just slightly above the Halo Scythe, in my opinion, is down to its Ash of War. And I promise, not everything in this list is going to be dictated by certain Ashes of Wars, but when it comes to Destined Death, it's kind of hard to argue that it's not extremely useful in the game, especially when you come to realize that when you do apply Destined Death to your enemies, they will then immediately have 10% of their health bar removed, which they also cannot heal back as long as that grey bar is there, and that is applicable to all enemies. So where I was just mentioning with the Halo Scythe, if someone is resistant to holy damage, you're not really going to be doing as much damage with the Ash of War. This thing will still always take away that 10% health and then deal additional damage over time for the next 2 or 3 seconds, and the Ash of War does that at range. Throw in the fact that it's a dagger, so it doesn't weigh anything, and it also requires very minimal requirements to even use it. It means that this weapon can be used in not only any Faith build, but literally any build in the game. As long as you've got 18 points of Faith, you can slap this bad boy into your second weapon slot and then just alternate in between your main weapon and this one, hit enemies at range with the Ash of War, dealing a nice chunk of damage, and then also dealing damage over time like I mentioned earlier. Of course, in New Game Plus 7, the damage isn't going to be quite as good, which is why this weapon couldn't really go any higher, but for something so stylish, so cool to use, and can still do a significant amount of damage even though it is just a dagger, it still features in my top 10. It just obviously couldn't go any higher, just simply because it doesn't deal enough damage. But something that is going to deal a lot more damage is going to be the weapon in the number 8 spot, and that goes to the Coded Sword. Now, this weapon is actually just pure faith scaling, like it doesn't scale off of any stats, and it's also pure holy damage. So unfortunately, it does suffer that same fate of if you're coming up against any enemies that are highly holy resistant, then of course you're not going to be doing as much damage, but it is still a straight sword and has a relatively fast moveset and can pack an absolute punch with its charged heavy attacks. But the Ash of War, the unblockable blade, also does a high amount of stance damage and, like the name suggests, goes through enemies' shields. So if anybody's got their shield up, i.e. a Crucible Knight, you can just pierce through that as if it wasn't there in the first place, deal the same damage that you would be dealing as if he wasn't holding his shield up, which can of course be extremely useful. I'm sure this is also extremely useful in PvP for that exact same reason, but the other benefit of this Ash of War is it actually extends the weapon by a significant amount, meaning that you don't have to be right on top of your enemies to use it and still get the same damage output and benefits in stance damage, allowing you to keep the stance pressure on your enemies whilst being at a safe distance and breaking enemy stances relatively easily. I know a lot of people were sleeping on this weapon, myself included, so again, this is another weapon where if you haven't used it before, definitely go and pick it up, try it for yourself, because I can guarantee you you're going to have an immense amount of fun with it. Saying that, we're moving on to the number 7 spot, because at number 7 we have got ourselves the God Slayer's Greatsword. Now hear me out a second, I can see some of you already typing that this list is a huge L, why is God Slayer's Greatsword so low in the list, oh my god, you suck. Well, the reason why it isn't too much higher is because this weapon does need a lot of time to get the best damage output from it. Where it is a colossal sword, of course the moveset is going to be a little bit slower, but this weapon is actually one of the fastest colossal swords in the game, so it does have a slight advantage against the other weapons in that same category. It's just still, unfortunately, a lot slower. The recovery window from doing things like charged heavy attacks or jumping heavies, again, is going to be relatively long, and that fact also applies even more so to the Ash of War on this weapon. The Queen's Black Flame turns this weapon into an absolute powerhouse, and you can deal a tremendous amount of damage if you get the full thing off. It's just getting that full thing off, because especially if you're trying to run this in the DLC or against later game bosses that like to move around a little bit more, you are going to leave yourself vulnerable, because essentially there's 2 phases to this Ash of War. But after you do the initial swipe, you can then press your Ash of War button again to do a bigger slash, dealing even more damage. But as I say, it's very much high risk, high reward, because you are going to be stuck in that animation for a very long time. So like I said earlier, good luck trying to use this in the DLC. But as I mentioned earlier, it is a colossal sword, so still does good base sort of damage anyway, so even if you do just have to rely on the weapon itself, you're still just going to naturally be doing a lot of damage, and you also have additional fire damage with it being Black Flame, so it is still very, very useful. And like I say, although it's here in the number 7 spot, it doesn't mean it's bad by any stretch of the imagination. I just personally would prefer 6 other weapons, and one of those weapons is the one that we have in the number 6 spot, and that is going to go to Siluria's Tree. A very, very fun and powerful crucible weapon that just so happens to be a great spear, which also means it does pierce damage, which if you didn't know is the best damage type a weapon can do, as it deals additional damage to the enemies. So again, much like the God Slayer's Greatsword that we just talked about, if you do just want to rely on the base damage and the base moveset with this weapon, you can do, and you're going to have a very successful time of doing that. But the reason why this is just slightly above the God Slayer's Greatsword, in my opinion, is mainly down to its Ash of War, Siluria's Woe. This is a chargeable Ash of War which allows you to sling a wave of golden magic at your enemies, and it covers a very large distance too. And this also does a nice amount of stance damage, as well as the base weapon doing a good amount of stance damage too. So again, although you're not really going to see me breaking too many stances with really any of the weapons in this gameplay, because again, it's from New Game Plus 7, in the first couple of new games you will be having an immense amount of fun just breaking enemies with this. It's a very solid weapon and deserve it of being slightly above the rest that we've talked about so far. And if you haven't picked up this weapon yet and tried it for yourself, then definitely go and do that now, because you're not going to regret it. But as much as I really enjoy using this weapon, there's 5 more that I think are even better, and the weapon that we have at the number 5 spot is going to be the Blasphemous Blade. Okay, now I can really see you typing these comments being like, oh my god, this list is scuffed. But hear me out again. The Blasphemous Blade is of course infamous for being one of the most broken weapons in the game. I mean, you can literally whack on a good enough armor, stand still, and then just spam your Ash of War button, and hey presto, the Demigod Slayed text will appear on your screen. But as much as that's the sort of like meta or like the way to abuse this weapon to just get victory really easily, it is still a great sword, so does still do a tremendous amount of damage just naturally anyway. And again, it's fire based, so much like the Godslayer's Greatsword, it's extremely useful against most of the endgame bosses, bar like Moog or Fire Giant. But if you were to strip the weapon of that obviously busted Ash of War, it probably isn't the best greatsword, which is why I'm only putting it here at number 5, because it's kind of like the Rivers of Blood. Yes, okay, it deals a tremendous amount of damage, and obviously in this case it heals you as well. It's just not super fun just relying on that one button just to get you through the game. But I knew I had to include this weapon somewhere, because if I didn't have this weapon in the list, then this list really would be scuffed, because obviously you can't really do a top 10 faith weapons video and not include this. But for me personally, where this is a subjective list, I wouldn't put it any higher, but I'm fully aware of how easy it makes the game, and it probably should be number 1 if you're doing an objective list of like what is the best. But as I say, it's subjective, and where this weapon can basically just turn the game into easy mode, it's not always super fun to be using. But of course, if you are struggling with a boss, just put this in your hands and the boss fight will be over in about 10 or 15 seconds. So like I say, had to be on the list, but it's not going any further than the number 5 spot. So now that I've ruined my like to dislike ratio, I guess it's time to move on to number 4 spot. And at number 4, we have got ourselves the Fire Knight's Greatsword. Because like I just mentioned a moment ago, if you have to boil things down to the actual weapon itself, the Fire Knight's Greatsword is an absolute beast. This is actually the first weapon from the DLC in this list, but it's not going to be the last. And I am kind of breaking the rule a little bit with this weapon, because I'm more specifically talking about the Fire Knight's Greatsword when you infuse it with something like the Flame Spear or Flame Skewer Ash of War, because if you do that, you can then apply flame art to this weapon, which will turn the scaling in Faith from a D into a B, and dramatically increase the damage output with this weapon. When you do that, you have a fantastic split in both fire and physical damage, which allows you to deal the damage you're seeing on screen, which is just outright ridiculous. But even if you were just to keep it with the regular stamp attack, the upwards cut, you would still have a very good physical and fire damage split, and you would still also have an Ash of War that is very nice to use and can actually corpse launch NPCs. Again, having something that can just deal with NPCs nice and easily is always going to be fun to do. But like I say, I'd rather put something like Flame Spear on, because then you do also have additional range, which makes it miles faster and miles better than something like the Godslayer's Greatsword that we mentioned earlier. In fact, a nice little gimmick is that this weapon shares its charged heavies with the Zweihander and its light attacks with the Godslayer's Greatsword, making it the fastest colossal sword in the game, and of course does crazy stance damage outputs naturally as well. So if for whatever reason your enemies are still alive after doing sort of like 3, 4, 5,000 damage in very quick succession with this weapon, you will be breaking their stances, allowing for a load of critical hits. And for me, as I've said before, this is basically an upgrade on the Godslayer's Greatsword, which is why obviously it's a lot higher in this list. But again, we've got 3 more weapons in this list, and to sort of like kick off the top 3, if you will, at the number 3 spot, we have got the Euphoria. You guys will probably know how much I've banged on about this weapon if you're fans of the channel, and how much I talk about twin blades in general. You also probably know that I love Faith builds, so by having a twin blade that is super powerful and scales off of Faith and can do things like this, it's probably quite clear to see why this is in the top 3. But yes, the Euphoria is an insane twin blade, which has a unique ability called Luster that after 4 attacks will actually charge up your weapon, storing energy, adding additional holy damage whilst you're storing said energy. And that Luster has 2 levels, so basically hit an enemy 4 times in quick succession, you'll store the first sort of like light of damage, and then if you do 4 more successful hits in quick succession, that light will then become brighter, making the base damage output with this weapon just outright ridiculous. And that Luster also directly dictates what the Ash of War does. The Vortex gets heightened damage and duration with each level of the Luster that you have. So if you fully charge this up and then decide to use your Ash of War button, you're just going to hit your enemies with an absolute light cannon, which again can do a high amount of stance damage and can knock enemies back with the final blow, but you can get staggered out of this. This is kind of like one of the only drawbacks with the weapon, because again, it has a very nice physical damage output, so pretty much against every enemy that you come up against, you are still going to be doing thousands of damage in very quick succession, just because it's a twin blade, and twin blades are just nuts. But other than that, it's still super fun to use. It has a really cool gimmick by giving you just additional damage for being extremely aggressive. So for me, personally, this is deserved of being in the top 3. Saying that, there's 2 more weapons that I think are slightly better than this, and the weapon that does unfortunately come in the number 2 spot, so just missing out on number 1, is going to be the Magma Blade. This is a weapon that has appeared in many different videos, in many different lists, because I cannot stress how good this weapon is. Don't get me wrong, it's an absolute pain in the bum to try and get it because it is extremely rare and it's only dropped by like 2 enemies in the entire game, but the reason why it's so hard to get is because it's an absolute monster. Not only is it a curved sword, so again has an extremely fast-paced moveset, again fused with fire, so allows you to do a lot of damage very, very quickly, but also has an insane Ash of War called the Magma Shower, which is essentially spinning slash, but this time with throwing lava all over the place, dealing additional damage over time as long as your enemy's in that lava. And this Ash of War also does a ridiculous amount of stance damage, so again, for a weapon that is only a curved sword that doesn't really weigh very much, you can deal an absolute butt ton of damage just with the weapon itself whilst you're spinning, whilst doing additional damage with the lava that's on the floor, whilst also doing a lot of stance damage, making this an all-round beast. And although we've only been really talking about weapons like as a standalone, so not power stancing anything, if you were to power stance this, you can then make use of the curved sword's jumping light attacks, which are busted, proc the multi-hit boss, hit your enemies with the Ash of War, and then they're literally going to be deleted in a matter of seconds. As I said a moment ago, I cannot stress how good this weapon is. It's definitely something you should go and get, but it's not the number 1 weapon. And just before we do showcase the number 1 weapon, I do just want to give a few shout outs to some other weapons that didn't quite make the cut. Things like Malekith's Black Blade, that again is a very cool weapon to be using. I'm assuming some of you probably expected this to be in the list, but it actually shares a similar fate to the Godslayer's Greatsword, where it does take a little while to wind up, and because you are taking quite a long while to use the weapon, especially if you're using the Ash of War, you are extremely vulnerable. The FP cost of that Ash of War is also through the roof. Again, it's even more high risk than something like the Godslayer's Greatsword. But then we also didn't include things like the Sacred Relic Sword. Again, it's just another brilliant greatsword that could be included in this list. If, say, you wanted to take out something like the Halo Scythe, there was a lot of weapons that I was throwing up in the air that should have probably been at the number 10 spot, but ultimately went with Halo Scythe. So Sacred Relic Sword could have very easily been there because again, his Ash of War is insane, but it does again cost a lot to use the Ash of War, and then you're just left with again another greatsword, which we've got about 5 of them in the list so far. But then again, sticking with the greatswords, you can also use things like the Inseparable Sword or even the Golden Order Greatsword, which again are very good options. So those are also another few more faith weapons that you can use if you really want to, which again are going to be really, really useful and fun to use. But now that we've done enough stalling, it is time to reveal the weapon that we have at number 1. And the best faith weapon, according to yours truly, goes to the Ordovis's Greatsword. Another greatsword, but possibly the best greatsword in the game, because where the other greatswords obviously share the same moveset and a very similar damage output with its physical damage, Ordovis's Vortex is the key difference. The reason being is because when you fully charge this Ash of War and release it on your enemy's head tops, you will be doing over 50 stance damage every time you do this, meaning that 2 or 3 uses of that Ash of War will break every single enemy in the game. Add in the fact that you can throw on things like Stone Barb Cracked here to make that even quicker, and your first couple of new game pluses will be an absolute doddle, because again, not only will you be breaking your enemy's stance 24/7, but you'll be dealing thousands and thousands of damage with that same move. So again, if for whatever reason your enemies survive whilst you're using this move, they will have their stance broken, but there's a very good chance that they won't live to see that critical hit take place. Also, it's fantastic against NPCs again, because if for whatever reason you go to use it and they roll out the way of the initial slam down, it does additional like AoE attacks with that sound wave effect that you can see, which will catch enemies if they try and roll out of it, and it has a very good strength holy split, meaning that this weapon is versatile against every single enemy. Again, this Ash of War is chargeable, so if you are in certain fights that are a lot quicker, like in the DLC, you can use the uncharged version, which will still do a healthy amount of stance damage and do similar results, obviously in a much safer fashion. But like I say, it is a great sword, so much like all the other great swords that we've had in this list, you still got a base weapon that is still extremely strong and again can break your enemy stances at will, so there's not a lot of bad things to say about this particular weapon. In fact, I don't really have anything else to say because the footage should be speaking for itself, and again, this is from New Game Plus 7, so just imagine what it would be doing in the first couple of New Game Pluses. And with that, that concludes our top 10 Faith weapons video, and I of course want to know from you guys, do you agree? Have I disgraced you by having things like the Godslayer's Greatsword and the Blasphemous Blade as low as they are? Obviously feel free to let me know in the comments, but try and keep it somewhat civil. Like, I'm all ears for an actual discussion about it. But as I mentioned in the intro, I've had an idea to make this like a little mini series, and we are going to be going through all of the rest of the stats in the game. So if you want to stick around for the rest of the list and you're new around here, make sure that you're subscribed to the channel, and that way you won't miss out on any future videos. But also, whilst you're doing that, if you happen to enjoy this concept or like this top 10 video, please also consider leaving a like rating on the video, because it genuinely does help out the channel a lot, and it's also the quickest and easiest way to let me know that you're enjoying these top 10 lists and you want to see more of them in the future. And I know I haven't said it already and I'm saying it right at the end, so there's going to be a few of you asking in the comments, but if you want to find out the best build to use around all of these weapons, I did create an ultimate Faith build a couple of months ago, which still is very valid to this day. So basically, if you're looking for the best build for any of these weapons that we've mentioned today, that one build will have you covered for everything that I've mentioned in this video, and you can check that video out in the description down below. It'll be like the first link down there, so definitely check that out if you're interested. But other than that, I think I've said everything that I need to say about this video. Get your own top 10s in the comments as well if you want, like I say, to spark that conversation, because it'll be really interesting to know if you guys have a similar list or something completely different, because of course it is subjective at the end of the day. But otherwise, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, night, morning, whatever time it is that you're watching this video, and I guess I will catch you in the next one of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.